Hi, it's cold and rainy here in Scotland. In the last video, I said I would talk about the emotional centre or brain. As with all centres, when we're first learning something, we're up in the intellectual part of that centre. In the Bible, it talks, or in the apocryphal Gospels of Thomas, for example, it talks about when two are united within the same house. Those two would be the intellectual element in us and the emotional element in us. And when these two are united, we can truly move mountains. The intellectual part of the emotional part of the brain is those two united. It is the most noble part of our being. It's able to consider things from many different aspects or angles, and to understand and to forgive others for their behaviour and also oneself. As with all centres, learning takes place in the intellectual part of the centre, which in the moving centre I referred to as when one learns a bike. All the movements which have to be coordinated require the intellectual element of that centre before they're passed down eventually to the instinctive moving part of it, which is when they are stored in long-term storage, or one could say in our backbone. In the emotional centre, it's the same. We learn language and the little pleasantries which make life go by more smoothly. Hi, how's it going? How's your day been? What are you up to? These kind of things, which give the impression of our caring for others and how they are. These mechanical emotions can also be a source of great suffering, because as with all centres, in the instinctive moving parts of them, they have momentum. That is, once they're set in motion, they can keep on going until they run out of energy. So we may find ourselves going over a particular emotion time and time again for longer periods of time and being unable to escape. And in fact, it would take an effort from the intellectual part of the emotional centre to escape. The intellectual part of the emotional centre has all of the tools which one has gathered in life for doing this kind of thing, and knows how to apply the correct tool in the correct moment. It's also the source of our being able to sustain consciousness for longer periods of time, as it knows how to produce consciousness and how to sustain it and how to avoid the different things which can take us out of consciousness. It can also see through the illusions of the other parts of our makeup, which will occupy the space of consciousness. And it's the only part of our makeup which will give up its place in order that consciousness can manifest. When I was a child, there were things happened which, as with many, many children all over the world, should never have happened. And again, when I was around 14, something happened which should never happen to a child. It was terrible. And all too many people have these kind of experiences. And sometimes they just mark them and drag them down for all of their life. For me, this terrible experience made me question life, how something like this could happen, and created in me a desperate need to understand how these things occur. And the conclusion I came to is that these things occur in sleep, in a low state of awareness, or no awareness, one could say. And often they cause the same low awareness that they came from in us as we suffer and suffer and suffer throughout our lives in relation to them. But for me, as I said, it created this desperate need to know. And so when I was in drama school, I read huge amounts of psychology. I was actually told by the director of the college I should be reading more plays. See, I didn't realize then, but plays are psychology. The better ones deal with some of the issues that trouble our souls throughout our lives. But eventually, I found out that the precise part of our mechanics which had caused the individual in my particular experience to do what they had done was the emotional part of the emotional part of the brain. It's very extreme. As with all different parts of the brain, it has duality built in. And in its case, it's I love you, I hate you. In the moving part of the brain, it's movement or rest. In the instinctive part, it's pleasant or unpleasant. And the intellectual is I understand, I don't understand. But the person who created this experience was momentarily in the negative part of this emotional part of the emotional part of the brain. And as we say in Scotland, had lost the plot and become insane. Because when one is in that part, one is insane. One is crazy. I'm sure you've experienced it yourself at some point in your life. If not, then you're a saint and you have no need to be here. As a matter of fact, get in touch and leave your number and I'll be in touch with you. Opera is a good example of the emotional part of the brain. If you watch opera, it's all big emotions. And in this part, our emotions are very large in one direction or the other. They don't have the equanimity of the part above, the emotional part, and the intellectual part of the emotional part. In the Bible it says in Revelations, and behold, a great mystery appeared in heaven, a woman standing on the moon, clothed in the sun and surrounded with 12 stars around her head. I sometimes think of this as being a depiction of the intellectual part of the emotional part of the brain and its ability to forgive and understand and put everything in its proper place. Well, that's about all I can think of at the moment in relation to the emotional brain. But it's really the part of us which has to be strengthened. It's like our angel, and the instinctive brain in us is like our devil. They're at odds. The instinctive brain has no wish to produce consciousness. As a matter of fact, when consciousness arises in us, it will try to shake it off in any way possible, through sex, drugs, rock and roll, you name it, what your favourite way of getting rid of consciousness is. And this is a very useful thing to know about yourself. It will be kind of hidden from you, but if you keep watching for a long time, and the king of the intellectual part of our emotional brain will enable us to make that search, to watch and see what it is in us that takes us away most often. The teacher Gurdjieff, who I regard as perhaps the greatest teacher to have ever taught, he described these things which hide consciousness or cover it from us as buffers, like the buffers in between a railway carriage that keep the two carriages separate without ever intermingling. So we go from one part of our being into another part without experiencing any contradiction. So we can go, for example, from one part of the emotional part of the brain, which loves someone, into the other half, which hates them, or feels very bad towards them at least, without noticing any contradiction. His pupil Ouspensky said that, or I can't remember, maybe it was Gurdjieff himself, said that buffers were a means whereby one could always feel one was in the right. But Mr. G also said that if you kept on watching and looking, you would eventually see at first the tail of the dog as it ran away. And if you sustained observation, then perhaps eventually you would see the back legs and the tail, and so on. You get the picture. Anyway, enough about the emotional part of the brain. We could feed it by reading biographies of people who have made it to the aim of becoming more unified, and also by reading the Vedic literature. All noble literature feeds the intellectual part of the emotional part of the brain, which is our personal savior. Ciao for now. Bye-bye.